The theory of NPCs applied to human reality emerges as an intriguing metaphor that has gained popularity in recent years. When we look around us, we can notice that certain people seem to live their lives as if they were following a predetermined script, almost as if they did not have free will or their own conscience. This concept was borrowed from video games, where NPCs are characters programmed to perform specific functions, without the ability to think on their own or deviate from their pre-established codes. What makes this theory so fascinating is that it resonates with observations that many of us have made at some point. Have you ever noticed how some people seem incapable of thinking outside the box or questioning dominant narratives? How do they repeat the same phrases and opinions they heard without showing any critical reflection on what they are saying? These behaviors raise profound questions about the nature of human consciousness and about how many people actually live with full mental autonomy. Throughout history, several philosophers and thinkers have explored similar concepts, even without using the term NPC. Thinkers like Plato, with his famous myth of the cave, already suggested that most people live in a state of illusion, accepting shadows as reality without ever questioning the true nature of the world. Centuries later, thinkers like George Gurdjieff proposed that much of humanity lives in a state of awake sleep, reacting mechanically to external stimuli without true inner consciousness. Modern neuroscience seems to give some support to these ideas, demonstrating that a large part of our daily decisions are made by what we call autopilot, unconscious brain processes that allow us to act without conscious reflection. Studies suggest that around 95% of our daily actions are performed in this way, which raises the question, how many people actually wake up from this automatic state and develop a reflective awareness about their own lives? The concept of NPCs in the real world also finds parallels in several spiritual traditions that talk about awakening or reaching higher levels of consciousness. These traditions often suggest that most people live in a state of unconsciousness, following social and cultural patterns without questioning them. What NPC theory does is translate this ancient concept into a contemporary language using the metaphor of digital games. It is important to note that this theory does not necessarily suggest that some people are inferior or less human than others. Instead, it proposes that different individuals can operate at different levels of self-awareness and mental autonomy. And the most interesting thing, anyone can be functioning as an NPC in certain aspects of their life, following social scripts. So without question, even though they have full capacity to awaken to a more conscious state, the question remains, how do you know if you yourself are not living like an NPC? The very nature of this condition suggests that those who are in it do not realize their state. Perhaps the simple act of considering this possibility is already a first step towards leaving the predetermined program. After all, a real NPC would never question whether they are an NPC, right? Reflection on levels of consciousness is not new in the history of human thought. Plato, one of the pillars of Western philosophy, already addressed this issue in his allegory of the cave. In this narrative, he describes chained prisoners who spend their entire lives looking at shadows projected on a wall, believing that these shadows represent all of reality. When one of them breaks free and sees the outside world, he discovers that he was living in an illusion. When he returns to the cave to share his discovery, he is ridiculed by those still trapped. This allegory suggests that most people live in a state of unconsciousness, accepting as absolute truth only what their senses and social conditioning show them. George Gurdjieff, 20th century philosopher and mystic, developed this idea further, proposing that the normal state of humanity is what he called awake sleep. Second Gurdjieff, although people seem conscious, most live reacting automatically to external stimuli, without true self-determination or self-awareness. He argued that awakening from sleep requires continuous, conscious effort, something most people never do. To Gurdjieff, an average human being has several selves that take control in different situations, with no unit of consciousness coordinating these multiple personalities. Modern neuroscience brings fascinating discoveries that seem to corroborate these philosophical views. Brain monitoring studies demonstrate that around 95% of our daily decisions are made by unconscious processes. Our brains evolved to save energy by putting repetitive actions into automatic mode. This means we drive to work, brush our teeth, or even carry on basic conversations without true conscious attention. Researchers like Daniel Kahneman, in their book Thinking Fast and Slow, they show how our brain has two systems, one fast and automatic and another slow and reflective. Most of us operate predominantly in System 1, without activating conscious, deliberate thought. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre addressed this issue through the concept of bad faith, where people deny their own freedom and responsibility, preferring to live according to predetermined social roles. To Sartre, many unconsciously choose the security of conformity over the anguish of authentic freedom. It's more comfortable to follow social scripts than face the vertigo of creating your own path. This tendency to avoid responsibility for one's existence results in lives that are essentially programmed by external expectations. Alan Watts, philosopher who popularized Eastern philosophies in the West, spoke about how many people live inside their heads, trapped in mental narratives that they confuse with reality. Second Watts, most people live in a state of collective hypnosis, believing themselves to be an ego separate from the rest of the universe. This state of identification with thoughts and social conditioning prevents us from experiencing what he called natural consciousness, a state of full presence in the present moment, free from automatic conceptualizations and judgments. Quantum physics has also brought interesting perspectives on consciousness. Experiments such as the double-slit experiment suggest that conscious observation itself can influence the behavior of matter at a subatomic level. Scientists like Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff propose that consciousness may be a quantum phenomenon, operating in the microtubules of neurons. These theories suggest that different states of consciousness may represent different levels of quantum coherence in the brain, possibly explaining why some people appear more awake than others. Recent cognitive psychology studies have revealed a surprising phenomenon. About 30% of people report not having an internal dialogue, that voice in the head that most consider universal. This phenomenon, called mental aphantasia, when referring to the inability to create mental images, raises profound questions about the nature of conscious experience. If some people don't experience this internal dialogue, do they experience the same depth of self-awareness? This discovery appears to give some scientific support to the idea that different people may be operating at different levels of reflective consciousness. The theory of the bicameral mind, proposed by the psychologist Julian Jaynes, suggests that consciousness as we know it today is a relatively recent evolutionary acquisition. Jaynes argues that until about 3,000 years ago, humans did not possess the same introspective self-awareness that we have today, and that their brains functioned in a bicameral fashion, with one hemisphere speaking and the other listening to these commands as if they were divine voices. Although controversial, this theory offers a fascinating perspective on how different modes of consciousness can exist, even within the human species, depending on cultural and historical factors. The philosophical zombie is a fascinating thought. Experiment proposed by Australian philosopher David Chalmers, which revolutionized debates about consciousness. Imagine a person who behaves exactly like you and me, talks, works, interacts socially, but has no internal conscious experience. This hypothetical being would react appropriately to stimuli, express emotions, and even discuss philosophy. But on the inside, there would be no one at home, no subjective experience, no feeling of existing. This concept raises the disturbing question: how can we know if the people around us have conscious experiences like ours? The idea of the philosophical zombie goes far beyond a simple academic exercise. It touches on something we have all observed at some point. Many individuals go through life acting in extremely predictable patterns without demonstrating any sign of critical self-awareness or the ability to think for themselves. The phenomenon becomes even more evident when we observe collective behaviors on social networks. Millions of people seem to absorb and reproduce ready-made speeches, instantly adopting dominant opinions without any apparent reflection. When asked about these opinions, many are unable to articulate their own arguments, resorting to stock phrases and commonplaces. It's almost as if they are programmed to repeat certain thought patterns without ever critically examining them. Behavior surprisingly similar to what we would expect from a philosophical zombie. Immediate rejection of any thought that escapes the prevailing narrative is another telltale sign. People operating in zombie mode tend to react with automatic hostility to ideas that challenge their conditioning without even considering the arguments presented. This automatic defensive behavior is more like a programmed reaction than a conscious, considered response. The absence of true intellectual curiosity and the inability to question one's beliefs may be indicators of a less developed or less active conscience. Research in cognitive neuroscience partially corroborates this idea by revealing that many decisions we believe we make consciously are, in fact, determined by unconscious brain processes. Famous experiments, such as those of Benjamin Libet in the 1980s, they demonstrated that our brain decides to act before we are even aware of this decision. This suggests that much of what we consider conscious choices may be more automatic than we would like to admit, bringing us somewhat closer to the status of philosophical zombies, at least in certain aspects of our cognition. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein explored a related concept through his arguments about the impossibility of a private language, the idea that language is inherently social and that our most intimate thoughts are shaped by shared linguistic structures. If we take this idea to the extreme, we might question how much of our internal dialogue is really ours and how much is just a reproduction of linguistic and conceptual patterns absorbed from society. Could it be that some people live their entire lives simply reproducing absorbed discourses externally and internally without true originality or self-awareness? Evolutionary psychology offers a possible explanation for these zombie-like behaviors. From a survival and adaptation perspective, an individual who simply follows group norms without questioning them may have adaptive advantages in many social contexts. For most of human history, deviating from groupthink could result in ostracism or worse. Thus, our species may have developed cognitive mechanisms that favor conformity and automatic acceptance of dominant beliefs, with only a minority developing the ability and courage to truly think for themselves. Awakening from being a zombie to being fully conscious usually involves some kind of rupture or existential crisis. Moments of intense suffering, major life changes, or encounters with deeply challenging ideas can force a person to go off autopilot and begin to question their own existence. This awakening process tends to be uncomfortable precisely because it requires abandoning the security of automatic thought and facing the vertigo of true mental freedom, something many prefer to avoid, choosing unconsciously to remain in the comfort of unconsciousness. The true distinction between a philosophical zombie and a fully conscious person may not be binary but a spectrum. We all probably operate like zombies in certain aspects of our lives, following automatic routines and thought patterns. The crucial difference would be in the ability to awaken from this state, question one's own thoughts and behaviors, and exercise some degree of mental autonomy in relation to social and biological conditioning. From this perspective, full consciousness would not be a permanent state, but a continuous practice of self-observation and questioning that few are willing to maintain consistently. From the first years of life, we are subjected to an intense process of social programming that fundamentally shapes our perception of the world and our behaviors. The process begins in the family, where we not only learn the language and basic customs, but also absorb beliefs, prejudices, and worldviews without any critical filter. A young child does not question whether what their parents teach is correct. They simply absorb this information as absolute truths. This early conditioning forms the neural foundations upon which all future thought will be built, making it extremely difficult to question these fundamental assumptions later in life. The traditional educational system, despite its noble intentions, often reinforces this programming rather than encouraging independent thinking. In many schools around the world, the predominant model is still memorization and repetition. Students are rewarded for reproducing information and punished when they question authorities or present divergent thoughts. The philosopher John Taylor Gatto argued that modern schools were deliberately designed not to create thinkers, but obedient workers who follow rules without question. The focus on standardized testing and the pressure for conformity create people trained to seek the correct answer rather than developing genuine critical thinking. Mass media and social networks deepen this programming through sophisticated psychological influence techniques. Algorithms designed to maximize engagement feed us content that reinforces our existing beliefs, creating echo chambers where we are rarely exposed to truly different perspectives. Furthermore, techniques such as the constant repetition of certain narratives, the strategic use of emotions such as fear and outrage, and the oversimplification of complex issues create a distorted reality that shapes our perception without us realizing it. When the same phrases, images, and frames are repeated over and over, they become part of our automatic thinking. Social conditioning is reinforced by our innate desire for belonging and acceptance. Studies in social psychology, such as the famous Solomon Asch, demonstrated that most people are capable of denying the evidence in their own eyes to conform to the group's opinion. This impulse to agree with the majority has evolutionary roots. For most of our history as a species, being excluded from the group meant almost certain death. This subconscious fear of social rejection makes us extremely vulnerable to peer pressure and majority opinions, even when those opinions run counter to our direct experience or common sense. Language itself is a powerful instrument of mental programming, as it structures and limits thought itself. Words loaded with emotional connotations, biased framing, and false dichotomies form the structure through which we interpret the world. When certain terms are constantly associated with positive or negative emotions in the media and public discourse, we develop automatic reactions to these concepts that precede any rational analysis. Politicians and advertisers deliberately exploit this phenomenon to manipulate public opinion without having to resort to substantive arguments. The phenomenon of cognitive dissonance explains why it is so difficult to break this social programming. When faced with information that contradicts their established beliefs, most people experience intense psychological discomfort. To alleviate this discomfort, the brain tends to automatically reject new information, distort it to fit into the existing belief system, or rationalize reasons for ignoring it. This psychological defense mechanism prevents many people from even seriously considering perspectives that challenge their programmed worldview, creating an almost impenetrable barrier to truly critical thinking. The contemporary economic system contributes significantly to the suppression of critical thinking by keeping people perpetually busy and financially insecure. With long work hours, exhausting commutes, and constant financial worries, most people simply don't have the mental energy or free time to deeply question social structures and dominant narratives. When everyday life is a constant struggle for survival, the capacity for deep reflection becomes an inaccessible luxury. Furthermore, the constant bombardment of entertainment and distractions offers a temporary escape from this stress, but it also serves to direct attention away from fundamental questions about how society is organized. The psychology of sunk cost investing also makes it difficult to break away from social programming. After spending decades believing in certain ideas, building an identity around them, and perhaps even making important life decisions based on those beliefs, admitting that this system of thought may be fundamentally flawed would represent a devastating psychological loss. It's like realizing you've built a house on quicksand. Most people would rather deny the existence of quicksand, no matter how evident, than face the painful task of completely reconstructing their understanding of the world and, by extension, their own identity. Collective programming operates as an almost invisible but extremely powerful phenomenon in our society. Recent global events have demonstrated with stunning clarity how millions of people can quickly adopt the same opinions, use the same phrases, and express the same feelings almost simultaneously. This synchronization of thought does not occur by coincidence, but through sophisticated mechanisms of social influence. Major crises, whether health, political, or economic, often trigger an intensification of these processes. You can see how almost overnight, terms and concepts that were never part of everyday vocabulary suddenly become ubiquitous, with millions of people repeating the same phrases as if they had always known them. Systematic repetition is the most fundamental aspect of collective programming. When the same message, slogan, or narrative is constantly repeated across multiple channels, television, newspapers, social media, celebrities, and even in everyday conversations, it gradually settles in the mind as an accepted truth, even without substantial evidence to support it. This phenomenon, known in psychology as the illusory truth effect, demonstrates that mere repeated exposure to a statement significantly increases the likelihood of us believing it. Joseph Goebbels, Nazi minister of propaganda, understood this principle when he stated that a lie repeated 1,000 times becomes truth, not because it turns factually into truth, but because our brains are programmed to confuse familiarity with veracity. Social control also manifests itself through the manipulation of language, as predicted George Orwell. Today, we see the proliferation of emotionally charged terms that effectively shut down debates before they can even begin. Certain words work like switches that, when activated, automatically turn off critical thinking for many people. This phenomenon is closely linked to the linguistic concept of presuppositions. When we accept the linguistic framework proposed in a discussion, we are often unconsciously accepting a series of hidden premises that direct thought towards predetermined conclusions. The phenomenon of moral panic demonstrates how collective programming can generate nearly identical behavior in large groups. When a perceived threat is amplified by the media and public discourse, we see waves of synchronized outrage and conformity behaviors that quickly spread through society. Individuals who would normally consider themselves independent and rational begin to participate in collective rituals of social purification, denouncing perceived transgressors and publicly demonstrating their adherence to group norms. This behavior demonstrates a return to tribal patterns deeply rooted in our evolutionary psychology. Fear of social exclusion can easily override individual reason. Modern educational systems, although seemingly dedicated to the development of critical thinking, often function as refined mechanisms of cognitive standardization. The emphasis on standardized testing, correct answers, and the penalization of creative divergence promote a specific type of intellectual conformity. Students quickly learn that success means reproducing expected responses, not questioning fundamental assumptions or exploring alternative perspectives. This training for cognitive conformity lays the neural foundations for susceptibility to collective programming in adulthood. It is no coincidence that many of history's greatest innovators were those who dropped out or failed in conventional educational systems. The economic structure of modern society reinforces these social control mechanisms. The commercialized attention model that underpins much contemporary media encourages the production of content that generates strong emotional reactions, especially fear, anger, and outrage, at the expense of balanced and nuanced analysis. At the same time, growing economic precariousness keeps many people in a constant state of insecurity and stress, conditions in which the human brain tends to resort to simplistic thinking and authoritarian solutions. When constantly preoccupied with basic needs and financial survival, people have few cognitive and emotional resources available for deep questioning and independent thought. The simulation hypothesis proposes a disturbing statistical argument. If some advanced civilization eventually developed the technological capacity to create simulations of reality indistinguishable from base reality, then there would potentially exist billions or trillions of simulated realities for every original reality. In purely probabilistic terms, this would mean that it is mathematically more likely that we are living in one of these countless simulations than in the single base reality. This argument does not categorically state that we live in a simulation, but it logically demonstrates that this possibility cannot be ruled out based on probabilities. Elon Musk, CEO of Tesla and SpaceX, took this idea even further by publicly stating that the chance of us living in base reality is only 1 in billions. His reasoning is based on the current technological trajectory. If we consider the Exponential advancement of computing and virtual reality in recent decades, and project this development hundreds or thousands of years into the future, it seems inevitable that we will eventually be able to create completely convincing simulations. If we accept this premise, then the logical conclusion is that we are probably already part of a simulation created by a more advanced civilization, possibly a future version of our own species. Recent developments in quantum physics add a fascinating layer to this discussion. Physicist James Gates made an extraordinary discovery while studying mathematical structures called supersymmetry. He identified error-correcting codes embedded in the fundamental equations that describe our universe. These codes are identical to those used in internet browsers and other software applications to detect and correct data transmission errors. The presence of these specific mathematical patterns in the fundamental equations of physics raises intriguing questions. Why would natural laws contain structures that are characteristic of computer programming? This finding, while not proving the simulation hypothesis, certainly offers what some consider suggestive circumstantial evidence. The behavior of subatomic particles exhibits characteristics that appear consistent with a simulated universe. The uncertainty principle of Heisenberg, which establishes that we cannot simultaneously know the precise position and speed of a particle, and the collapse of the wave function in quantum mechanics, where particles exist in probabilistic states until they are observed, could be interpreted as mechanisms for optimizing computational resources. In a sophisticated simulation, it would be more efficient to calculate particle properties only when necessary, rather than constantly tracking the exact position and speed of every particle in the universe, just as modern games render only what is in the player's field of view to save resources. The existence of fundamental physical constants, precisely tuned to permit life, constitutes another interesting element in this debate. Physicists have observed that if any of the universe's several fundamental constants, such as the strength of gravity, the strong nuclear force, or the cosmological constant, were even slightly different, the universe would be unable to support complex life or even stars and galaxies. This fine-tuning of the universe, known as the anthropic principle, has traditionally been explained by theories such as the multiverse or intelligent design. However, it could also be perfectly explained by the simulation hypothesis. Our universe was deliberately programmed with constants that allow complex life to emerge, as a simulation without conscious observers would serve little purpose. The apparent limitations of the speed of light and the Planck time structure could represent computational constraints of the simulation. In modern computer games, there are always fundamental limitations that are imposed by the capabilities of hardware and software. Similarly, the speed of light as a universal speed limit and the existence of a smallest unit of time could represent the processing limits of the cosmic simulation. This would explain why these universal constants exist in the first place. They are the fundamental parameters of the program that runs our reality. The nature of consciousness remains the greatest mystery to both mainstream science and proponents of the simulation hypothesis. How subjective experience emerges from physical matter, or code in the case of a simulation, is what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness. Interestingly, if we live in a simulation, our consciousness could be explained in several ways. We could be characters controlled by players on a higher level of reality, advanced AI programs within the simulation, or even consciousnesses of real beings temporarily connected to the simulation, similar to the concept explored in the film The Matrix. The simulation hypothesis does not solve the mystery of consciousness, but it does offer new contexts in which to consider it. The philosophical and existential implications of the simulation hypothesis are profound. If we truly live in a simulated reality, does that mean there is a purpose to our existence? What entity or civilization created the simulation and why? Are we being observed, as in a cosmic experiment or form of entertainment? These questions echo fundamental religious interrogations about creators, divine purpose, and free will. Perhaps more disturbing is the possibility that the simulation could be turned off at any time, or that fundamental parameters of reality could be changed by operators. However, even if we live in a simulation, our subjective experience and suffering, remain real to us, the simulation would be our concrete reality, not just an illusion. The structure of modern work serves as a fundamental pillar to keep people in a state of sleepwalking. Most contemporary jobs require long hours of repetitive tasks that consume mental energy without stimulating creative thinking or deep reflection. After an 8 to 10-hour workday, plus tiring commutes, most people arrive home mentally exhausted, with reduced cognitive capacity for any activity that requires concentration or critical thinking. This chronic mental exhaustion is not an accidental side effect, but functions as an efficient mechanism of social control, ensuring that the majority of the population remains in a state of receptive passivity, consuming entertainment and products without questioning the fundamental structures that have shaped their reality. Constant financial insecurity represents a powerful way to maintain the state of collective sleep. When people are perpetually worried about bills, debt, and basic survival, their brains remain fixed in crisis management mode, focused on immediate needs. Neuroscience shows that under chronic financial stress, the brain prioritizes short-term thinking and immediate solutions, significantly reducing the capacity for abstract, philosophical, or critical thinking. Studies show that merely worrying about financial problems can temporarily reduce cognitive ability by up to 13 IQ points, the equivalent of a sleepless night, thus keeping a large part of the population in constant financial precariousness. Even in developed countries, serves as an efficient mass cognitive suppressor. Mass entertainment functions as a sophisticated escape and pacification mechanism. While in the past, Roman bread and circuses required physical arenas and large state expenditures, today we have infinitely more efficient entertainment delivery systems available 24 hours a day. Streaming services, immersive games, and algorithmically optimized content provide constant, highly effective escapism. The problem is not entertainment itself, but how it is designed to maximize engagement, undermining our ability to deal with boredom, a state of mind that has historically served as a catalyst for introspection and creativity. Neuroscience. Studies show that periods of boredom are essential for memory consolidation, emotional processing, and creative thinking. By systematically eliminating boredom from our lives, modern entertainment technologies effectively remove the mental white spaces necessary for authentic reflection and deep questioning. The medicalization of unconventional mental states serves to maintain cognitive conformity. Individuals who demonstrate thought patterns that are significantly different from the norm, whether by questioning fundamental social structures or by perceiving reality in unconventional ways, often receive pathologizing diagnoses. While genuine mental disorders certainly exist and require compassionate treatment, there is a worrying tendency to classify any significant deviation from normative behavior as pathology. This approach often results in excessive medicalization, where psychotropic medications are prescribed not to alleviate genuine suffering, but to suppress behaviors or thoughts that challenge established social norms. The result is a potent form of chemical control over divergent consciousness. The control of information, even in apparently open societies, operates in a subtle but effective way. While direct censorship is rare in democracies, more sophisticated mechanisms determine which perspectives receive mainstream attention and which are marginalized. Techniques such as framing of narratives, selective delegitimization of sources, and what political scientists call the Overton window, the spectrum of ideas considered acceptable in public discourse, effectively limit the scope of thought permitted without the need for explicit censorship. Concentrated media corporations, recommendation algorithms, and economic dependence on advertisers create invisible filters that determine which realities are presented to the public. The result is an illusion of informational diversity, while fundamentally challenging perspectives remain effectively invisible to the majority of the population. The social isolation of those who question dominant narratives acts as a powerful deterrent to independent thought. Humans are intrinsically social creatures with a fundamental need to belong. When individuals begin to seriously question established structures or narratives, They often face social ostracism, ridicule, marginalization, or outright rejection by social groups. This isolation is not only emotionally painful, but it activates the same brain centers as physical pain, creating real neurological suffering. The perspective of this isolation functions as a powerful preventative mechanism, discouraging most people from significantly diverging from accepted thinking, even when they notice inconsistencies. The subconscious fear of tribal rejection, deeply rooted in our evolutionary psychology, serves as an invisible but effective barrier to the awakening of critical consciousness. Awakening from the state of autopilot begins with a simple but profoundly transformative step: questioning everything. This is not about adopting a stance of destructive skepticism, but rather about developing a healthy habit of checking. When you receive news, ask yourself, who benefits from this narrative? When you adhere to a personal belief, ask yourself, where did this idea come from? Is it really mine, or was it implemented? This process of questioning should extend to your most fundamental beliefs about politics, religion, society, and even yourself. We often find that our own opinions are simply echoes of external voices that we have internalized without critical analysis. Breaking predictable patterns in your life is a fundamental strategy. Our brain loves routine. It's efficient and saves energy. But this efficiency comes at a cost: unconsciousness. Try different routes to work, talk to people outside your usual circle, read books in genres you normally avoid, visit places you've never considered. Each new experience creates new neural connections and awakens dormant parts of your consciousness. A simple exercise. For a week, do something different every day, no matter how small. Notice how this affects your perception and level of mental presence. Exposure to new ideas is particularly powerful as an antidote to automatic behavior. Our brain naturally resists information that contradicts our established beliefs. It's what psychologists call confirmation bias. Overcoming this bias requires conscious effort. Take time to study philosophies and cultures different from your own. Explore scientific concepts that defy common sense. Participate in debates where you are in the minority. These experiences can be uncomfortable, but discomfort is often a sign of mental growth and expansion of consciousness. One of the most challenging aspects of this awakening is accepting the possible loneliness that accompanies it. When you start to question accepted narratives and break out of established patterns, many people around you may react with discomfort or hostility. This is not surprising. Your questioning implicitly challenges their way of life, suggesting that perhaps they, too, are living without full awareness. You may be labeled a conspiracyist, difficult, or weird. These reactions are predictable and ironically confirm the programmed nature of the social response to those who challenge the system. Meditation and mindfulness practices offer powerful ways to combat autopilot. Studies show that just 10 minutes of meditation a day can significantly increase our ability to notice when we are operating automatically. The practice doesn't have to be complicated. Simply observe your thoughts without judgment. Notice when your mind wanders and gently bring your attention back to the present moment. Over time, you will develop a kind of inner observer that can identify when you are being drawn into automatic behaviors or adopting opinions without reflection. Another effective strategy is to keep a question diary. Take a few minutes every day to record questions about your experiences and beliefs. Why did I react angrily in that situation? What makes me believe this is the best approach? What assumptions am I making about this person or situation? The act of writing physically activates different parts of the brain and promotes deeper reflection. Review these notes periodically and notice patterns in your thinking. We often discover automatic scripts operating in our minds that we would never notice otherwise. Remember that awakening is not a destination, but an ongoing journey. No one is completely free from autopilot, and we easily return to it if we don't maintain vigilance. Modern society is designed to keep us asleep, consuming, working, and following trends without question. The forces that promote this collective falling asleep are powerful and persistent. True awakening requires daily commitment to awareness and inquiry. The good news is that each small moment of true awareness expands your capacity for future moments, creating a virtuous cycle of increasing mental freedom. The choice between living as an NPC or as a truly conscious being is available to us in every moment, and that choice, repeated consistently, sets the course of our existence. So we come to the fundamental question you must honestly ask yourself. Are you truly in control of your life, or are you just following a programmed script? Are your opinions truly yours, formed through careful reflection and critical analysis, or are they simply echoes of what you have been conditioned to think? Are your daily choices, from what you consume to how you spend your time and energy, are conscious decisions aligned with your deepest values or automatic responses to external stimuli? The answer to these questions not only matters for your personal growth, but potentially for the future of human consciousness in an increasingly automated world, both technologically and psychologically.